Hello, dear students. I won't be able to join you for the session on Thursday. Unfortunately, I had my right shoulder dislocated, so I've been advised to give as much as rest to my right shoulder for next 3 weeks. So this is what we are going to do. I'm going to deliver sessions online, which means that I'm going to record the session on YouTube. You can then access it, and then if you have any doubt, you can always ask to me when I'm in class from fifth session onwards. So today's session is about how do we understand organizational culture and how does it affect the design of the organization. Now, if you remember, I always asked you to use this analogy of understanding why, how, and what. So when we think about organizational culture, I think it's important for us to understand that why do we actually need organizational culture? Or do we really determine organizational culture? So when we think about that, it's important for us to take in mind that what is the role of organizational culture? What does it actually do? Or do we really have to study about it? How does it matters to us? The reality is that organizational culture essentially determines how your organization behaves inside the organization and outside the organization. So in a way, it determines how you work with your colleagues inside your organization and how your organization is able to do business outside. Okay. Now, it also affects you in a way because when you're working in teams, you as teams are able to determine how you're going to shape the team culture so that you achieve a particular task. Remember the phase norming in the stage of team development. This is where a group or a team starts building cohesion, where you start developing norms in the way you want to perform things, in the way you share certain values, and the way you want to do any projects or your style of doing projects. Okay, now have a look at this video of Google or Zappos or I advise or German organizations, and you can see how organizations are shaping their organization culture to keep into consideration how employees react, how employees understand the surroundings, and how employees are able to express their talent. So, given the fact that we are trying to understand organizational culture, it's important for us to realize that there is no one standard organizational culture. Let me give you an example. When I was working with UN back in 2011, a couple of my friends who were working in Google Poland came to New York, to for a visit, and they asked me to show me around. Like they just asked me if you can show us around UN. And then I gave them a tour of UN. And in the end, one of my friends, she said, wow, such a good mission to work on. I would really like to work here. And the lady who was standing next to us in the elevator, she said, you bet UN is a very bureaucratic organization. So a thought came to my mind. I just told them, guys, you just did a tour of UN, so why don't you just take me to Google and see? I've heard a lot about it. So they actually took me to Google's New York office, and whatever you see in the video, I've actually seen that, like free food and, really cool offices. Now, when I saw that in Google, and again, when I reflect back my experience in UN, I see that these are two different organizations with completely different purposes. UN is a multi-stakeholder, multilateral organization which is working on humanitarian issues. Google, on the other hand, is an innovation-based organization which is in technology. So the kind of culture which Google needs requires people to be creative, whereas in UN, they are also considering that inputs from all the stakeholders are well considered, and that's why it is much more process driven and much more bureaucratic driven, right? So two different organizations, two different purposes, and different organizational culture and different organizational structure. So you can easily transpose this by understanding why are public authorities more bureaucratic, why aren't they flexible, or why are startups teams much more flexible, and then eventually they get on becoming more bureaucratic. The idea for you is to understand that why do organizations adopt a particular culture? And your role as a manager is to understand how you can influence culture in a positive way. So you can refer to some definitions of culture. It's the collective programming of mind that distinguishes the members of one category of people from those to another. Acquired knowledge that people use to interpret experience and generate social behavior. And some facts, right? Culture refers to group. So you can have a group culture. You can also have an organizational culture. And it is entirely learned. We learn to possess cultural characteristics of the group we belong to. That's what I exactly meant when I'm talking about norming phase. You gradually learn to adapt your behavior in a certain way when you're working in a particular organization. And it's also important, I think it's also funny to understand that we never really consciously think about the culture, right? You just can't go outside and say, hey guys, just give me a good organizational culture for 10 euros. No, it doesn't work out that way. And that's why it is kind of subtle, but it still has physical manifestations in the way organization is structured. So here you can look at some characteristics of culture. Okay, so yeah, there you go. Right. So let's take an example of McDonald's, and you can see how culture in itself is manifesting at three levels. So you have the first base level thing that there is a need in society for having a fast food, right? So how do you address that need? Basically, people are busy, right? So that is an underlying assumption. If you want to satisfy that assumption, then what you have to do is you really have to ensure that the product which you're trying to deliver is standard. It has to be efficient, and technologically speaking, you have to have sufficient amount of machines in place which can create those fast foods in a consistent way, right? So this is where McDonald's comes into it picture, where you will see that there is a consistency of product. The product is fast, and it's a generic product which perhaps most of the people would like to have as a fast food, right? So you can see how culture manifests itself in three different ways. Let me take another example, which is very pertinent to India in a way. Why Indian culture or why Indian organizations tend to be much more hierarchic. You know, when it comes to the relationship of boss and an employee. So the underlying assumption here is that the one who is senior to you needs to be respected because he is the one having much more experience and knowledge. So this underlying assumption expresses itself in the value, which is respect for authority, hierarchy, obedience of the decisions, and then you see it manifests itself at the surface level where you have to behave in a very particular way where the hierarchy has to be respected. That's why you would see perhaps most of the Indians will always say sir, 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 you know, or always when they are writing in emails, they are very formal in a way. So you can see how the value of respect for senior person transforms into a hierarchical culture. Hmm. Next slide shows about how cultures can influence organizational performance. And I think it's important for us to reflect that you have two ways of seeing it. One way you would rather see a culture may lead to negative performance, and a culture may also lead to positive performance. So for example, you will see why sometimes there are some cases, some employees in the company may commit suicide and they leave a suicide note. And it's a clear example of showing that how organizational culture becomes much more competent or it's not satisfying. On the other hand, you will also see some organizations who would be ranked one of the best organizations to work for. So what makes them best? Trying to understand that what do they do to ensure that their employees are performing well. So here you can see different types of organizational culture. You can refer to them in the article. So it is power-based, role-based, task-based, and person-based. So let's look at it one by one. Power-based organizational culture manifests when the decision making is in the hand of one person. So you can take into account small businesses or family-owned businesses or a small shopkeeper where he is the one who is making decisions. So it's centralized decision making. One person has the authority. The role-based organizational culture manifests in the large organizations where bureaucracy is manifested in terms of roles which are divided between different people. So it's based on roles and expertise, and which leads to bureaucratic organizations, right? So you kind of divide the work and the responsibilities based on the roles and processes. The third type of organizational culture is task-oriented, which you may see in small startups where organization is pretty much horizontal in nature, where the team is collectively working on a particular task. So take an example of a team which is trying to work on developing a product. So this team is developing the prototype of the product. The same team is working on marketing strategy. The same team is working on the launch strategy. So it is task-based oriented. And the last type of organization culture is person-oriented culture, where a person has a liberty to do what he feels like contributing. So you will probably see that culture in associations or small clubs or NGOs, where the value of an individual is given much more importance. So you can see from power-based to person-based, the culture is very mechanistic in nature. But if you look from person-based to power-based, you'll see that the organization culture is organic, which means it is quite fluid in nature. You can have a look at this slide where in power-based culture, the employee does what she or he is told to do. In role-based, the employee acts within the parameters of his or her job description. In task-based, the employee acts in the way he or she considers suitable for the task. And in person-based, the employee or person does his own thing. And by the way, you can refer to this figure in the article of business and organizations as cultures, which you will find on Blackboard. So the question which comes to our mind is, can we change the culture? And I think it's a very good question, because as a manager, you will always be in this dilemma about how can you influence the culture change, because when you are joining an organization, so you enter into an already existing organization culture. So how effectively you can change the culture, which if it is already there. However, if you are a team leader or if you are an important contributor in the team, you can certainly shape the organizational culture. So maybe you can take later on the time to reflect on the case of Continental Airlines, and you can discuss the questions on how organizational culture was changed by the leadership. So it's crucial for us to understand that when you're trying to change the culture, changing the culture from bottom to top is extremely difficult, but it may be relatively easy. I don't say it won't be difficult, but it may be relatively easy when a CEO is trying to set up certain values and ideals and he's trying to instill that in his organization. So the commitment of top leadership is very much important. Okay. The rest of the slides you can always refer to. Now let's come to the next part, which is also relatively short. We discussed about the organizational culture and the way culture manifests in the way how decisions are taken, how you behave in the organization, and how organization expresses itself. And one of the ways in which organization would express itself is by establishing its organizational structure. So you can easily take into account that the organization having role-based structure will be much more bureaucratic in nature, while An organization like a startup or an NGO might be much more horizontal in nature. So just have a look at different types of organizational structure, and it's not important for you to just you refer to it in details, but you can always see that an organizational structure is important for you to determine how you are clearly dividing the labor, how you are dividing the task, and how you are creating different departments. And especially it is even much more pertinent when you are, for example, you are given an authority as assuming, let's say you are an expat, you have to go and start a new plant of already existing company in another country. So the responsibility lies on you, as in how do you understand the organizational culture in your home country, and when you are about to start a new company, how do you want to divide the roles and responsibilities? How do you see the tasks to be achieved? How do you see that creation of certain departments would lead into efficiency of tasks? So based on that, you can always decide on what type of organizations you would try to establish. So you have, for example, functional structure here. You have structure based on geography, client or product. And then you have also organizational structures which are much more based on, on the projects. And then you have matrix organizational structures where various structures are superimposed on each other, which means you are actually reporting on two different departments. Let's go to next. This is something which you can easily refer to in later on. Now, we discussed already about the role-based organizational culture, which can manifest in terms of bureaucratic design and structure, where authority and power are based on objective criteria, rules and procedures and behaviors are important, and decision making is fully rational. So you may perhaps imagine that you're going to a bank and you cannot get a favor because you have to follow the rules and regulations. Or let's say you go to a prefecture and they will ask you for certain documents. If you don't have a particular document, the person who is attending to you may not be kind to you because, I mean, of course, he may be kind, but he is not at the liberty to exercise his duty until and unless the needs which are completely rational are fulfilled by you. You can refer to that later on. Let's look at the horizontal design and structure. So an organization has an horizontal design and structure when um, it is having a flat hierarchy or a flat structure. This would be easily assumed in a case where you are, let's say, working on a project. And in a project, you are reporting to two or three people who have more or less the same type of authority. Or if you're working in a startup where there is no one unity of command, but rather the unity of command is shared by the people. So the advantage of horizontal design or structure, which may be existing in a new organization or in an existing organization, is the flexibility or speed and efficiency in which teams are able to adapt and perform a particular task. So for example, you can take your own group as such. You have a horizontal organization structure in which there is no dominant authority, okay, and you have flexibility to adapt the way you want to work. But this may not be the case for if you are working in a company which is very much hierarchical or role-based company. So you can refer to these. Then we have another two types of organization designs, which is hollow design and modular design. Now, this is very interesting. Now, hollow design is a type of organization, and you will perhaps see that in a manufacturing process is, um, let's take an example of H&M, right? Most of the process, except the core process, which is designing, will take outside. So you will see organizations like H&M would have at least, let's say, 90 to 100% of the manufacturing outsourced to Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, or Turkey. So what organization does is it keeps its core competencies with itself, and it outsources the entire processes outside. And then you have a modular type of organization where you will see only certain parts and processes are outsourced. So here you can again take an example of Airbus, for example, which has many suppliers, but the parts come from those suppliers and finally they are assembled in the main Airbus plant. So what we see here is that a module of a particular organization is outsourced. So it is partial outsourcing. So you can try to compare on how both types of designs have their own advantages and disadvantages, keeping in mind that how they have some of their competencies in place and some of the competencies not in place. So for an example, if you take an example of Apple, okay, Apple, let's say, has outsourced part of its manufacturing process in a foreign country. Now, if the supplier of that country is not able to respect the conditions of manufacturing, that's a loss for Apple because Apple cannot monitor it. Or you can clearly see that in fashion industry where fashion retailers have tough time in monitoring how their suppliers are keeping good working conditions and respecting basic human right and working condition laws. So you can finally come to understand that when we're talking about organizational design or organizational culture, you have on one side a typical pyramid-based design, and then on the other hand, you have more this kind of nucleus and cellular-like structures where teams and organizations revolve around a particular process and task. So that's it for today's session. I tried to be very much fast, and just in case if you have any type of doubt, you can always note it down and then you can ask me from fifth session onwards. Do not forget to refer to the readings and the preparation for the next class. And by the way, the news presentations will happen. Okay, so even if I'm not there, the respective groups have to assume the responsibility and share news presentations. So we will have one news presentation anyways for this Thursday. For a coming Thursday, I assume one group can automatically take up the responsibility and share the presentation. So that's it for today's session. Do not forget to work on your team projects. I would highly advise you to start thinking about the timeline, as in how you want to achieve the target of filmmaking, and what are the different needs and requirements for your group to work around that task. So you may already start thinking about preparing a time plan or a project plan and the way you want to achieve this project. Okay, and that's it for today. I hope you'll have a good day, and do not forget that you are allowed only to sign during the time of the class. If you delay that, you won't be able to sign on the attendance sheet, which is available at fourth floor at Cecile Gabriel's office. That's it for today. I wish you an excellent day ahead. Thank you.